So they're very deep-rooted and they can survive by themselves. The redwood trees, on the other hand, have very shallow root systems. And so how in the world do they survive the storms and the winds of life? Well, they can't survive in isolation. They only survive as a forest. They have to be around other redwood trees because they send their roots out and wrap their roots around their fellow trees. And so together they stand against the external forces against them. They are completely interdependent in regards to the source of their strength. And so we are not called to be independent silos. We are called to an interdependent body of Christ. And that's where our source should come as Christians. Not as being isolated, but learning to depend on one another. And so I just thought this was very appropriate as the backdrop for these slides. When I think about the future for this congregation, and I think about the future for the kingdom, I want everybody to be built strong, to be strong in their health, strong in their family, and mostly I want us to be strong in our spirits. I want us to be strengthened in what the Bible refers to as the inner man. So I wanted to talk to you this morning during the Bible class period about what's involved in building a strong spirit. In Luke 1 and verse 80, the Bible tells us that John the Baptist, as a child, grew and waxed strong in spirit. And so that's what we need to do. How many of you would like to be stronger in your spirits, would like to be stronger spiritually in the coming year? Let me see your hands. Great. The reason I wanted you to raise your hands is because you don't grow stronger by accident. You go stronger by intention, by a determination that this is what I want to do, and then ask God to help you to do it. It comes about by intentional effort. In fact, it comes about through prayer. The Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 3, 16 through 19 says, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being. See, that's what we're talking about today. So that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may be filled in the measure of all the fullness of God. And so we're here because I want to give you an intentional roadmap that you can follow. And the first thing I want us to do is to recognize that we can learn a lot about spiritual power from physically the strongest man, I believe, that ever lived and ever will live. And that is Samson. I mean, Samson was a man that killed a lion with his bare hands, the Bible says, as if it were just a little kid. And he was blessed with Herculean strength. And this man, Samson, he was not just some superhero out of some comic book that they made a movie out of it. No, this is a real historical character that really existed and that was given special superhuman strength for a special purpose. And so I believe studying the strongest man in the Bible, who ironically is going to die alone, blind, and miserable, a suicide, is a great example of how not to rely on physical strength, but to understand that by being consecrated to God, we can grow spiritually long into our adult lives. So we're going to look today at a character study of this man, Samson, and we can learn from him primarily as a good, bad example. Because though he starts off really well, as I mentioned, he ends up very poorly. There are 4 chapters in the Bible about Samson, Judges 13 through 16. And though he's very strong spiritually, I like to think about Samson as a man that was strong but incredibly stupid. And I mean that very sincerely. He had glaring weaknesses. His name is from the Hebrew, Shemish, which means like the sun. And so at a time of great darkness and a time of Philistine occupation, God decides in advance, before he's even born, to consecrate him to the service of the Lord and to begin the process of destroying the Philistines, which had so tortured and made life difficult for the Israelites. And understanding the reason for this man's downfall and avoiding those things can be hugely beneficial to us as Christians. So basically, I want us to look at 3 attitudes that will weaken our spirits, and then complement that with 3 habits that will strengthen our spirits. So let's look first at the first problem that we see with Samson, and that is self-indulgence. But before we get into this, I want to sort of continue with a little bit of background of this man. Physically, Samson was like a Rambo. But spiritually, almost from the very beginning, he's sort of a Pee Wee Herman. Giant physically, but a midget spiritually. And yet God had blessed him in the beginning of his life in every kind of way. He was talented, he had good looks, he obviously had ability and charisma, he appears to be handsome. He starts off great and he has some very early successes, but one day he lost it all. He winds up being a broken man, he became a failure, and he woke up one day and his strength was all gone. And I don't want that to happen to any of us. And this doesn't happen just like that. It's a slow process, and it can sometimes catch up to us, and we wake up one day and we just feel really spiritually weak. You know, we've had some years at Kirkland where we've been enjoying just a lot of numerical growth and a lot of positive things happening. But I still grieve over periodically having some of our members who we thought were really strong suddenly just sort of drop off the map. And we go to talk to them and they've just lost interest. And they eventually fall away. People who I never thought would fall away. And what I want you to realize is when that happens, we all need to look in the mirror and say, could I be next? Could I be one that wakes up one day and I just don't have the spiritual strength to continue anymore? Or maybe our doubts have gotten the best of us and we've lost our faith and it's just gone. I don't want that to happen to anybody here today. And I don't want that to happen to anyone in the Coeur d'Alene church family. And one of the ways we can make sure that doesn't happen is to listen really carefully to what I'm going to say today. Because we're going to talk about how that happened to Samson, how we can avoid those pitfalls, and then at the very end talk about some spiritual habits that will keep us strong in our inner being and in our faith and in our spirituality. Okay. The first attitude that destroyed Samson was an attitude basically of self-indulgence. And we find an example of this in chapter 14 of the book of Judges, verses 1 through 20, where Samson is living a very self-indulgent life. He was very undisciplined. He was a man that was just sort of impulsive. He was a slave to his impulse. You know, Seneca, the Roman historian, said, "No one is free. He was a slave to his own lust." And that's exactly true. Solomon had, as I mentioned, a lot of flaws. For some people, their flaws are the three vices of wine, women, and song. For Samson, it was women, women, and women. That was clearly one of his main weak spots. In fact, in 3 chapters, he falls for 3 different women. He keeps running into relationships, running out of relationships, and running from relationships. And the Bible says in chapter 14, the first 3 verses, that he sees this woman, a Canaanite, Philistine woman, a woman that's not going to do him any good spiritually, but he doesn't care, because that's not what he's thinking about. He says, she looks good, she pleases me, and he tells his father, get her for me, in 14 verse 3. And so, in spite of the fact that this man was making a choice that was not a good example, would not fit his Nazirite vow, he didn't care. He abandoned God's plans and instead followed his glands, you might say. She looks good, she lights my fire, so you get her for me. Way back when, Jim Morrison and the Doors used to sing, hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? And it's a catchy tune, but it's a perfect example of confusing love with infatuation. I mean, you can have attraction at first sight, you can have lust at first sight, but you can't have love at first sight. You can't, because you can't love somebody you don't even know. Especially love someone you don't even know their name. Now, don't misunderstand the point here. Nothing wrong with sex and attraction. In its place, it's very good. Sex was invented by God. It was his idea. But he has told us we need to keep it under wraps, and we need to keep it disciplined and have it there as a part of procreation in marriage and a part of creating a bond between a husband and his wife. And it's supposed to stay within the bonds of marriage. We live in a society where they want to have every kind of sexual deviance and perversion not only allowed, but celebrated. And it's really a scary time when you look at the world around us. But even good things that are good in and of themselves can be harmful if they're out of control, if we allow us to obsess over them. That's true with food. We can obviously eat too much. It's true with money, necessary part of life. It's not going to satisfy us ultimately, but the Bible warns us about greed and not keeping money in perspective. It's true with food, money, sex, even sleep. Anything out of control will weaken you. So the first trap that weakens your spirit is when you make decisions based upon pleasure rather than upon principle. And that is so important. Put another way, when you make decisions based upon convenience rather than conviction. You know, when it comes to mate selection, we often are told in the world that you just have to find somebody that you fall in love with. As if, again, you fall in love as it's some sort of accident that you have no control over. The real issue for a Christian is not, am I in love with this person? Am I attracted to this person? Do I want to be with this person? Because you can fall in love with people that you have no right to be with. I've counseled with people that have committed adultery, that are married people. They belong to another, but they fall in love with maybe their secretary at work. And they think because they fell in love somewhere other that makes it right. No, it's just a weakness of character. You shouldn't have to act upon everything you feel. And as a Christian, the real issue is not, am I in love with this person, but is this person God's will for me? That's the issue. If you really want to keep yourself on a track toward heaven, is this woman here that I'm interested in, is she the type person that's going to strengthen my spirit, or is she going to tear me down? Or vice versa. Is this man the type person that's going to strengthen my spirit or going to tear me down? And so his attitude was, she looks good, she pleases me, I want her, and that's all I can focus in on. It's like living like this instead of looking outward and thinking about what kind of decisions I make and how will they affect my future, especially my spiritual future. Now I want to take a pause for just a moment. Does this idea of just, if it feels good, do it, is that the culture we live in? Does this sound familiar at all? Man, whatever you feel like doing, you ought to do, and who are we as a society to tell somebody else who they ought to love? Do you know what's being pressured upon us now? Is pedophilia. I mean, somebody's attracted to a child. Well, you may have that temptation. Don't act upon it. The temptation is not the sin, but don't abuse a little child, for heaven's sakes. Now you don't talk about pedophilia. Now you're supposed to talk about a minor attracted person, a MAP. So you change the terminology, and that's where they're headed next in our society. It's just so scary. Our society is becoming more and more like the pagan society that the early church had to deal with in the first century. And we need to stand out as points of light in darkness more than ever. The commercials say, you deserve a break today. Or the soft drink commercial that says, obey your thirst. Now my question is that always wise? Is it always wise to give in to whatever your physical desires or glands or whatever are telling you at the moment that you'd like to do? Let me ask you something. Is there something in your life right now that you know is wrong, you know is immoral, but you just keep saying, well, I owe it to myself, just this once. One more time, I'm going to indulge. You are playing with fire. And that thing that has got a hold on you is like Delilah. Talk about her in just a minute. Let me ask you something. If you went on a cruise and the captain came on the loudspeaker and said, hi folks, we're on this 2-week cruise today, welcome. I just want you to know that the hull in our ship has developed a small leak. But I just want you to know it's a small leak. I don't think that would give you much peace of mind on your cruise if it sounded like this leak was not going to be attended to. Because you and I know, both of us know, that a small leak will sink a ship, even a large ship, just as much as a large leak will. It just takes a little bit more time. And that's true with our characters. Any area that we're undisciplined in is going to weaken our spirits and diminish our spirituality if we become undisciplined in that area. And so, to be strong in spirit, I must discipline my desires. Desires are good and they're normal, but they're not all the kind of things you need to act upon. The Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves with the same attitude, because he who disciplined in his body is done with sin. And as a result, he does not live his life for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. So notice, that's what matters, the will of God, not what our glands or our bodies are telling us we would like to do at the moment. So what are we saying practically here? Just because I want something doesn't mean I should have it. Just because I can afford something doesn't mean I should buy it. Just because it's pleasurable doesn't mean that it's good. And just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean I should do it too. You and I need to avoid the trap of self-indulgence and say no to all of these bizarre pagan messages in our culture that are trying to draw us away from serving God and a measure of self-discipline in our lives. Secondly, resentment weakens my spirit. And that's the second trap that Samson falls into that caused him to lose strength. He was guilty of brooding resentment. That will zap someone's spiritual strength quicker than almost anything I can imagine. And we find this talked about in Judges chapter 15. Samson lived his entire life in a continual state of disappointment and anger and bitterness. Always seemed to feel misunderstood, disappointed. You've heard somebody say, I don't get mad, I just get even. Well, Samson would both get mad and get even over and over again. He seems to react violently to almost everything. And his primary motivation throughout the book of Judges seems to be getting back at people who hurt him. He had a victim mentality, and he knew nothing of the truth. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Do you have that in your spirit today? Do you sometimes have an attitude that everybody is against you and you're a victim of the world? You have kind of a brooding resentment you struggle with. You don't get rid of that, it will weaken your spirit. You know, one time Samson killed 30 men just to get even on a bet. He was very resentful and angry. And his excuse is always, they started it. They hurt me first. It's really sad to see this man that is so strong and had so much potential just allow his own spirit to be completely out of control. Now, all of us in life have been hurt. You can't get out of this life without being scathed and disappointed by others. That's just a part of this fallen world we live in. So I want you to think back in your mind at the different times that other people have hurt you, disappointed you, maybe even betrayed you. Now I want to ask you, are you holding on to that? That's a choice, to hold on to that hurt and to nurse it. And if you do that, it will cause bitterness in your spirit. And if you don't let it go, you will fall short of the grace of God. When you constantly take past hurts and bring them into the present, you spoil the present. That will sink your ship, sap your strength, and shrivel your spirit. All of us are hurt, but with Jesus Christ, we can have a forgiving spirit and let it go. The problem with Samson is he couldn't let anything go. And instead of having reasonable, mature actions and things he would leave in the hands of God, he just reacts violently and angrily to everything. Always the proverbial victim instead of acting out in ways that are mature. In Job chapter 5 and verse 2, Job says, resentment kills a fool, and envy slays the simple. In Job 18 verse 4, he says, you will tear yourself to pieces with your anger. In other words, you're only hurting yourself with your anger, holding it in. It's like taking fire into your bosom, thinking that somehow or other you're not going to get burned. It's like swallowing poison and hoping it's going to kill the person you're mad at instead of yourself. Samson lost his spiritual and physical strength because of self-indulgence and because he never managed his anger. Never learned to let it go. Never learned to forgive. And to be strong in my spirit, I must control my reactions. I must discipline my desires and control my reactions. Proverbs 25 and verse 28, whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. And Proverbs 29:11, a fool always loses his temper, but a wise man holds it back. Samson made a third mistake, and I don't want you to make this one. In addition to being self-indulgent and resentful, he was careless. This is the one that often catches us off guard. Carelessness will zap our spiritual strength and shrivel our spirit if we let it. So this third thing we can learn from Samson, pitfall we need to learn to avoid, is carelessness weakens my spirit. We see it in the next chapter, Judges 16, 1 through 20. Anytime you're careless with your time, your health, your money, your words, you're headed in the wrong direction. Anytime you get careless with your commitments, you make a commitment and then you don't keep it, damage your character and your reputation. Samson originally had, as we've said, amazing physical strength. And frequently throughout the text, before he's getting ready to take on the Philistines, it will say the Spirit of Jehovah came upon him. It's almost like, he becomes the Incredible Hulk. But notice, it was the Spirit of God that was still with him, doing God's will to push back the Philistines, that gave him his strength. Samson's going to forget the source of his strength, his commitment to God. He's going to be careless and cavalier with his Nazirite vow. You can read about the Nazirite vow in Numbers 6, 1 through 20. The word Nazirite means consecrated. It's the idea of giving to God 100%. Now, normally in the Old Testament, if someone took a Nazirite vow, they would do it for a month at a time. Sometimes they would extend it to 2 or 3 months. But on rare occasions, such as with Samson and with John the Baptist, they were consecrated and set apart for a special purpose from their mother's womb. In fact, an angel even comes to Samson's mother and tells her that this child is going to have a special purpose. He's going to be this bright light in Israel. And that he needs to be committed to me in a special way from the very moment of his birth. And so as a symbol of that vow, a number of things you were not to do. You were not to have any alcohol whatsoever. You had to have a special diet, not to ever touch a dead body under any circumstances, whether it is a human or animal carcass. And the next was the most notable, is you were not to cut your hair, beard, mustache, or even eyebrows for as long as you had the vow. That was a part of the Nazirite vow that was a symbol of your commitment to God, and that would alert everybody else who typically had pretty short hair that you were on this vow. And the length of your hair would determine how long you'd been on the vow. So Samson was never to cut his hair, as a symbol and a reminder to him and everybody else around him that he was consecrated to God for a special purpose. And as a special spiritual gift for his commitment, he was given this Herculean strength. A true superhero in many ways. But Samson, who didn't have to work for his vow, it was given to him in his birth. Like so many things that are just given to us, he took it for granted. He was careless with his vow. He made promises he didn't keep. He continually compromised his commitment out of convenience. He's toying with temptation. His attitude was not, how close to God can I get? How can I fulfill my life purpose? It was, how close to the fire can I get and not get burned? A lot of people live their lives that way. They go, I'm a Christian, maybe I know this isn't quite right, but I wonder how close I can get and not get burned. In Judges chapter 14, it talks about him killing that lion with his bare hands. And you'll notice he comes back later to the lion carcass, and some honeybees had set up their nest in the carcass of this lion. Must have been an unusual thing to witness, don't you think? And it says he ate honey out of the carcass of this lion, and that he gave the honey, some of it, to his parents, but he didn't tell them where he got it. You know why? This is early on in Samson's life. He wasn't supposed to be touching carcasses. Part of his vow was he wasn't supposed to be touching dead bodies, but he did anyway. And he's keeping it from his parents. He's cavalier from the very beginning and is a compromiser. He's going to break his parents' heart. And it started very early, and it started with something relatively small. Then in Judges chapter 16, we have the story of Delilah. By the way, Delilah is not his wife. Delilah is his mistress. Never married Delilah. And Delilah is hired by Samson's enemies to find the secret of his strength, seduce him, and take advantage of him. And Samson was not someone to say no to his lust. And he becomes aware of the game, and he still continues to play it. What kind of a fool would do that? And the first time Delilah comes and says, "Oh, honey," she's sweet-talking him, "please tell me, what's the secret of your strength?" So he says, "Well, if you'll tie me with 7 bowstrings, then I won't be able to break from them." And he goes to bed with the girl. He wakes up the next morning. Guess what? He's tied up with 7 bowstrings. Well, duh! Once he realized that, he breaks the 7 bowstrings. He kills the men that were sent to kill him. And that should have been the end of Delilah. He should have realized this woman is not out for my own best interest. This woman, she betrayed me, and she's trying to get me killed. And he learns later that she's paid because of her efforts. But instead, he lets this woman continue to lie by his side. See why I call him strong but stupid? The next night, she does it again. She says, "Oh, honey, please tell me what the secret of your strength is." Instead of saying, "Are you kidding me? Why should I tell you? I know what you're going to do with this." He says, "Oh, the secret of my strength is if you tie me with 7 new ropes, then I won't be able to break them." So he goes to sleep. The next morning he wakes up. He's tied up with 7 new ropes. By the way, Samson must have also been a very deep sleeper. And he breaks the ropes like they were nothing, and he kills the men that were sent to kill him. And he's just toying with this temptation. He's flirting with sin. And the next night, Delilah says, "Honey, you're really embarrassing me. You're making me look bad." Are you kidding me? It's really blatant. She's actually caring more about the money she's going to be paid than she cares about Samson. This time he says, "Well, if you braid my hair, I'll lose my strength." Notice, he's actually getting close to the real secret. The secret was in his hair, not that his hair made him strong, but it was a symbol of his commitment to God. He said, "If you braid my hair, I'll lose my strength." See how he's trying to figure out how close he can get. Now, let me back up just for a minute. What are you flirting with? What in your life do you know is flat out wrong? Like maybe looking at pornography? Anybody flirting with that? So easy now on your phone. It's free. Counseled a lot of men who struggle with pornography, and it started off with just a peek, just a curiosity. How about cheating on your income tax? How about flirting with another man or woman at work? You know it's wrong, but you're thinking to yourself, "Oh, just all innocent fun. I can handle it. I can get away with it." You're getting closer and closer. Satan is setting you up for a fall. Satan's already seducing you. Can't you see that Delilah is a perfect picture of Satan here? And in Judges 16, 15, and 16, he gets careless once too often. And he finally says, "If you cut my hair, I'll lose my strength." He finally gives in this lifestyle of compromise after compromise after compromise causes him to basically give away his secret. He can't say no to Delilah, even though he knows she's out to destroy him. What a weakling. So you know what happens next. You know, nobody ever plans to fail spiritually. Nobody ever plans to have their marriage fail. Nobody ever plans to have their business fail or their health fail or their finances fail. It just comes one bad decision after another. People don't fall off a cliff overnight. It begins with small slippages, small leaks that are unattended to. I start to let things slide, and then I wake up one day, and what's happened? All of a sudden, this person's lost their virginity, perhaps, or lost their credibility, or lost their reputation, or as preachers, lost their witness and ministry. The fact is, a chain is only as strong as its weakest length. So we all need to ask, what's the weak link in my life? Where am I vulnerable? Be on guard. Satan knows where you're vulnerable, and that's where he's going to hit you. So ladies and gentlemen, you're only as strong as what you've committed yourself to. If you're chipping away at that commitment, you're getting weaker and weaker every day. Look at what Solomon said. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. So, we're going to have to live with the consequences of everything we say, everything we do, everything we think. And when you tell yourself, I can get away with this, you're setting yourself up for failure. Remember, other people may not see what you do in private, but God sees everything. So, I want to ask you, what's the weak link in your life? Is it self-indulgence in some area? Is it carelessness? Or is it resentment? And if you recognize that's an issue, my question is, what are you going to do about it? To be strong in spirit, you have to develop good habits to address these slippages in our lives. I want you to notice Ephesians 6 and verse 10. It says, build up your strength in union with the Lord and by means of his mighty power. I want you to notice, God will give us special strength. We can have power that other people don't have that aren't Christians. But what's our job? We have to make ourselves in union with the Lord through the right kind of habits. And then we get the power. And then we get the discernment. And then we get to glorify God. So, I only have a couple of minutes here, but let me just quickly remind us of 3 things you probably already know. 3 habits to help strengthen your spirit. Number 1, have a quiet time. Get time with God every day. David said, show me the path where I should go. O Lord, point out the right road for me to walk. And so daily Bible reading, daily time nourishing the Word. Most of us take time out every day to eat to give our body physical nourishment. We've got to have the same sense of urgency to give our soul the nourishment it needs. Jesus often withdrew to a lonely place and prayed. At time of solitude, he's the perfect example. He said, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, then you may ask for anything you wish and you shall have it. How do his words remain in us? By feeding on them daily. And get together with believers often, like you're doing right now. Let us not give up the habit of meeting together. Instead, let us encourage each other. So many beneficial things from regular periods of time of fellowship. That's when you send your roots out like a redwood tree and you lean on one another and you pray for one another. It's a part of God's will. And then you have to give purposefully, liberally, and cheerfully. Why? Well, that's one of the ways you keep yourself from idolatry. Wherever your treasure is, your heart will be there also. And so we know what we need to avoid if we're going to really be strong in the Spirit. Let's make sure we're careful to avoid those things. Don't let the culture and the society around us enter into compromise and weakness. Because the things around us are dark. Have you ever been into a movie theater for like 3 hours or something? And you come out into the sun and it's like, oh, your eyes can hardly handle the light. What happened? Your eyes got adjusted to the darkness. The greatest danger today is that people get adjusted to the darkness around them as if it's no big deal. It's all a big deal, and we need to be children of light and sensitive to the things that can tear us down. At the end of Samson's life, we find that he binds, right? He's bound by the Philistines. Then he's blinded by the Philistines, and then he's grinding out as he walks around and is made fun of, being used like an animal. That's what sin does. It binds, it blinds, and it grinds. Be fearful of it. Stay away from it. And don't let it take control of your life. Okay, that's 10:30, so we're out of time. And I don't want to get careless and go overtime. So I'm going to let you out right now. I hope this has given you some things to think about. It's been very helpful to me. I hope it's helpful to you as well.